You want a rifle? The question hung in the dry afternoon air for half a second before the laughter came. It rolled across the Marine Corps firing range like a sudden gust of wind, bouncing off steel target frames and concrete barriers. A few Marines exchanged grins. Others shook their heads. One nearly spilled his coffee. Standing just outside the firing line, Walter Hayes looked at the young men laughing at him and said nothing. At 82 years old, he had long ago learned that silence often revealed more about a person than words ever could. The range stretched across nearly a mile of rugged terrain under a cloudless North Carolina sky. Heat shimmered above the dirt berms. Red range flags snapped sharply in the crosswind. The distant metallic clang of impacts echoed every few moments as shooters attempted to connect with targets positioned far beyond what most civilians would ever consider possible. Walter's pale blue eyes drifted past the Marines and settled on a glass display case near the entrance to the observation area. Inside rested an old rifle. Its walnut stock was dark with age. The metal carried the soft wear of decades. Most visitors barely noticed it. Walter couldn't seem to look away. "You mean that thing?" Sergeant Logan Pierce asked, still grinning. He stood nearly 6 feet tall with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his adult life being told he was exceptional. He followed Walter's gaze toward the display. "That rifle's older than half the people on this base." More laughter. Walter nodded slowly. "Still looks serviceable." A Marine standing nearby barked out a laugh. "Serviceable?" he repeated. "Sir, that rifle belongs in a museum." The group enjoyed that one. Walter simply watched the rifle. The display plaque beneath it gleamed under the afternoon sun. The words were too far away to read from where he stood, but he didn't need them. His eyes lingered on the familiar silhouette. Something about it seemed to pull at memories buried beneath decades of quiet living. Pierce folded his arms. "You shoot much these days?" The question carried the unmistakable edge of a joke. Walter finally looked at him. "Not as much as I used to." "Well," Pierce said, smirking, "good thing. These boys are training for long-range qualification. Not exactly a hobby range." Several Marines chuckled again. One of them adjusted the expensive ballistic computer mounted to his wrist. Another checked data on a tablet connected to weather sensors positioned downrange. Technology surrounded them. Screens, sensors, wind meters, software. Walter glanced toward the distant target area. The range flags flickered. One moved differently than the others. His eyes narrowed slightly. He noticed another shift farther down the valley. Then another. 3 separate wind patterns. 3 separate stories unfolding across the same stretch of ground. The young Marines remained focused on their equipment. Walter remained focused on the terrain. A sharp crack echoed across the range as another shooter fired. Several seconds later, a spotter called the result. Mississippi. The atmosphere changed almost imperceptibly. The laughter faded. Frustration crept in. This wasn't the first miss. It wasn't even the 10th. The difficult conditions had humbled nearly everyone on the line that afternoon. Walter listened quietly. Then he looked back toward the display case. The old rifle remained motionless behind the glass. For the first time, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Is it still functional?" he asked. The question triggered another wave of laughter, louder than before. But this time, Walter noticed something different. One young Marine standing near the back wasn't laughing. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks watched the old man carefully. Something about Walter's posture felt wrong for an ordinary visitor. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't arrogance. It was familiarity. As if the old man wasn't seeing a training range at all. As if he was remembering something the rest of them could not. The laughter gradually faded, but the amusement remained. It lingered in the smirks exchanged between the Marines and in the occasional sideways glance directed toward Walter Hayes. Sergeant Logan Pierce seemed particularly entertained. He picked up a spotting scope from a nearby bench and looked downrange toward a steel silhouette positioned nearly 1,400 yards away. The target stood against a distant hillside, barely visible through the shimmering heat rising from the ground. "Nobody has touched that target all afternoon," Pierce announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "The wind keeps shifting every 5 minutes." A few Marines nodded. Others checked their data screens again, hoping technology would somehow provide a different answer than it had an hour ago. The atmosphere carried the growing frustration of professionals who were accustomed to succeeding. Walter studied the distant landscape without saying a word. His eyes moved from one range flag to another, then farther beyond them, to the dry grass swaying along a shallow ridge, to a cluster of pines near a low depression in the terrain, to the faint shimmer of heat dancing above a patch of exposed rock. Ethan Brooks noticed it immediately. The old man was not looking at the target. He was studying everything around it. Another shooter settled behind a rifle. The crack echoed across the range. Several seconds passed. Then came the call from the spotter. Mississippi, right side. A frustrated groan rolled through the firing line. Pierce shook his head. Again. The shooter adjusted his position and prepared for another attempt. Walter finally spoke. His voice was calm enough that Ethan almost missed it. He is chasing the wrong wind. Pierce glanced over his shoulder. Excuse me. Walter nodded toward the distant valley. The flag near the target is not causing the problem. A few Marines exchanged puzzled looks. Pierce smiled. And what is causing the problem? Walter pointed toward a ridge nearly halfway to the target. That rise over there. Several heads turned. The terrain looked ordinary. Just another stretch of dirt and scrub brush beneath the afternoon sun. Pierce laughed softly. You can see that from here? Walter shrugged. You can see it if you know what to watch. The answer drew another round of chuckles. Yet Ethan noticed something interesting. Walter never sounded defensive. He never sounded offended. Every joke seemed to pass through him without leaving a mark. The old man simply observed. The next shot broke across the range. Another miss. This time farther off target than before. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that settles over people when confidence begins slipping away. Walter continued studying the landscape. A warm crosswind swept through the firing line, rattling loose paper targets and snapping the red flags overhead. He closed his eyes for a brief moment as the breeze touched his face. When he opened them again, something distant seemed to reflect in them. Not the range, not the Marines. Something older, familiar. Ethan felt an uneasy curiosity building inside him. Most visitors came to the range looking impressed. Walter Hayes looked like a man returning to a place he already understood. And for the first time that afternoon, Ethan found himself wondering whether the old man had asked about the rifle because he remembered it, or because he knew exactly what it could still do. The afternoon sun settled lower over the range, turning the distant hills a deeper shade of gold. Dust drifted lazily across the firing line whenever a breeze swept through. The shooters continued their attempts, but frustration was becoming impossible to hide. Expensive optics were adjusted. Wind data was recalculated. New firing solutions appeared on screens. The results remained the same. Miss after miss. Sergeant Logan Pierce rested his hands on his hips and stared downrange. His confidence had begun to crack around the edges, though he worked hard to hide it. Around him, the Marines remained focused, determined to solve a problem that seemed to grow more complicated with every shot. Walter Hayes stood quietly near the observation area. His attention never lingered on the equipment. He watched the terrain instead. The valley, the ridgeline, the movement of grass nearly 800 yards away. Ethan Brooks found himself studying the old man more than the targets. Something about Walter's calmness felt out of place. Most visitors would have become uncomfortable after being laughed at. Walter appeared completely unaffected. It was as if the opinions of everyone around him carried no weight at all. Another shooter fired. The sharp report echoed across the range. Several seconds later, the spotter sighed heavily. Low left. A groan followed. Pierce rubbed his forehead. Walk it in. Adjust and send another one. Walter tilted his head slightly. You are correcting for the wrong section of the valley. The words were spoken so casually that for a moment nobody responded. Then several Marines exchanged amused looks. Pierce turned toward him. You still on that? Walter nodded toward the distant hillside. The wind changes 3 times before the bullet gets there. A young corporal laughed. You can tell all that from standing over here. Walter looked at him. You can if you spend enough years paying attention. The answer sounded simple. Yet Ethan noticed something unusual. None of the older range staff were laughing anymore. A retired civilian instructor standing near the ammunition shed glanced toward Walter with visible curiosity. The man narrowed his eyes as if trying to remember something. Pierce folded his arms. Tell you what, he said. If you know the range so well, explain why nobody can hit that target. Walter's gaze drifted across the valley once more. Because everyone is looking at the target. Several Marines chuckled at what sounded like nonsense. Walter continued. The target is not the problem. The air between here and the target is the problem. Silence followed. Even Pierce seemed unsure how to respond. Ethan looked downrange. For the first time, he noticed what Walter had been seeing all afternoon. Heat shimmer twisted differently at different distances. Small patches of grass bent in opposite directions. The valley was not moving as one current. It was moving as several. Walter took a few slow steps toward the display case holding the old rifle. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass. The rifle rested exactly where it had for years, untouched and silent. Walter studied it for several seconds. His eyes settled on a deep mark in the walnut stock. Barely visible, easy to miss. Yet the moment he saw it, something changed in his expression. It lasted less than a second. A flicker of recognition. A memory passing behind pale blue eyes. Ethan noticed it immediately, and for reasons he could not explain, the young Marine suddenly became certain of one thing. Walter Hayes had seen that rifle before. Not in a museum. Not in a photograph. Somewhere else. Somewhere that mattered. The range grew quieter as the afternoon wore on. The easy laughter from earlier had faded into something more cautious. Nobody was quite sure why. Walter Hayes had not raised his voice. He had not challenged anyone. He had not tried to prove anything. Yet his presence seemed to pull attention toward him the way a distant storm pulls every eye to the horizon. Sergeant Logan Pierce walked toward the display case and stopped beside it. "You keep staring at that rifle," he said. "You know something about it?" Walter looked at the glass. The old walnut stock rested beneath decades of dust-free care. The metal still carried a faint sheen beneath the overhead lighting. "A little," Walter replied. Pierce smirked. "Let me guess. You had one just like it." A few nearby Marines chuckled. Walter's eyes never left the rifle. "No." The answer surprised them. Pierce raised an eyebrow. "No." Walter slowly shook his head. "Not one just like it." The old man lifted a weathered finger toward the display. "That one." The chuckles stopped. For a moment nobody seemed sure how to react. Then a corporal laughed. "Sure it was." More laughter followed. Walter did not respond. Ethan Brooks watched him carefully. The old man looked completely sincere. Not boastful. Not dramatic. Just matter of fact. As if he had commented on the weather. Pierce stepped closer to the glass case. "You were telling me that rifle belonged to you?" Walter shrugged slightly. "A long time ago." The answer only encouraged the skepticism. The display rifle had become something of a legend on the base. Generations of Marines had walked past it. The plaque described it as part of the installation's historical collection. Nobody expected an 82-year-old visitor to casually claim ownership. Pierce folded his arms. "Well, that settles it. We have ourselves a living museum exhibit." Several Marines laughed again. Walter remained calm. The crosswind swept across the range, stirring dust around their boots. Beyond them, another shooter missed the distant target. Nobody even sounded surprised anymore. Ethan glanced back toward Walter. Something caught his eye. On the shoulder of the old olive jacket, partially hidden by fading fabric and years of wear, sat a patch. It was small, frayed along the edges. Nearly the same color as the jacket itself. Easy to miss. Ethan had not noticed it before. He narrowed his eyes. The design was unfamiliar. Not a current Marine insignia. Not anything he recognized from modern training manuals. The patch looked old. Very old. Walter shifted slightly, exposing more of it. A strange feeling settled into Ethan's stomach. The patch did not look decorative. It looked earned. Nearby, Pierce was still smiling. "Tell you what," he said. "If that rifle really belonged to you, maybe you should tell us the story." Walter finally looked away from the display case. His pale blue eyes met Pierce's. There was no irritation in them. No challenge. Only a quiet patience that somehow made the younger man seem smaller. "Stories are not very useful on a firing range," Walter said. Then his gaze drifted toward the distant hills once more. "Understanding the wind is." Ethan looked back at the faded patch. For reasons he could not explain, he suddenly wanted a closer look. More than that, he wanted to know why seeing it made him feel as though he had just stumbled onto something nobody else on the range had noticed yet. The wind swept across the range again, carrying the dry scent of sun-baked earth and cut grass. Ethan Brooks found himself staring at the faded patch on Walter Hayes' shoulder. The design was almost worn away by time. Most people would have overlooked it entirely. Yet something about it refused to let go of his attention. Walter seemed unaware of the scrutiny. His eyes remained fixed on the old rifle resting behind glass. The afternoon sunlight caught the worn walnut stock, illuminating the deep mark carved into the wood decades earlier. For the briefest moment, the modern range faded from Walter's sight. The distant steel targets disappeared. The rows of Marines vanished. The warm Carolina air gave way to the heavy humidity of another place and another time. He was young again. The world smelled of damp earth and rain-soaked vegetation. Thick clouds drifted low across a jungle canopy that seemed endless. Everything felt alive. Every movement mattered. Every sound carried meaning. Walter remembered lying perfectly still for hours, listening to the wind move through distant leaves. Not because anyone had taught him to, because experience had taught him that nature always revealed more than equipment ever could. A young Marine beside him had once asked how he always knew where conditions would change. Walter had pointed toward a distant tree line and simply said, "The land tells you if you are willing to listen." The memory lingered. He remembered watching sunlight break through clouds hundreds of yards away. He remembered seeing grass move in one direction while leaves above moved in another. He remembered learning that success rarely belonged to the strongest man. It belonged to the most patient observer. The vision dissolved as quickly as it had arrived. Walter blinked and found himself standing once again beside the display case. The rifle remained motionless behind the glass. The range stretched before him exactly as it had moments earlier. Yet something in his expression had softened. Ethan noticed it immediately. The old man was not remembering a weapon. He was remembering people. A lifetime of lessons. A lifetime of earned wisdom. Nearby, another shooter missed the distant target. Frustration spread through the firing line. Sergeant Logan Pierce shook his head and muttered something under his breath. The expensive equipment surrounding the Marines continued feeding them numbers and calculations, yet the answers remained out of reach. Walter quietly watched the valley. The wind changed again, he said. Nobody had asked. Several Marines glanced toward him anyway. Pierce exhaled sharply. "You keep saying that." Walter nodded toward the far hillside. "Because it keeps happening." A few younger Marines laughed. Ethan did not. He was still studying the patch. The more he looked at it, the more convinced he became that it belonged to something important. Something old. Something forgotten. Without drawing attention to himself, he stepped a little closer. The faded stitching revealed fragments of a design he could not identify. It was unlike any unit insignia he had ever seen. A strange feeling settled over him. Not curiosity anymore. Recognition. Not because he knew what the patch meant. Because he suddenly suspected someone else would. And somewhere on the base, there had to be a person who could explain why an 82-year-old man could read the wind better than an entire firing line full of Marines. The afternoon was beginning to lean toward evening when Ethan Brooks finally made up his mind. He waited until nobody was paying attention to him, then stepped away from the firing line and pulled out his phone. Around him, the range continued its cycle of missed shots, recalculated data, and growing frustration. Nobody noticed the young Lance Corporal standing near the maintenance shed studying a photograph on his screen. Ethan zoomed in on the faded patch he had discreetly captured moments earlier. The image was imperfect. Years of wear had erased much of the original detail, but enough remained to raise questions. Questions he could not answer alone. He opened the base directory and sent the image to a senior administrative chief he trusted. The message was simple. "Have you ever seen this patch before?" Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to the range. Walter Hayes was no longer standing near the display case. He had moved closer to the firing line. Not close enough to interfere, just close enough to observe. The old man watched each shooter with the same quiet focus he had shown all afternoon. Another Marine settled behind a rifle. Another shot echoed across the valley. Another miss followed. Walter tilted his head slightly. "His position is fighting the slope," he said. The shooter looked up in confusion. Pierce rolled his eyes. "And what does that mean?" Walter pointed toward the ground. "His body is aligned with the bench instead of the terrain." Several Marines exchanged uncertain glances. The explanation sounded strange. Yet nobody immediately laughed this time. Something had changed. The old man had been correct too many times already. Pierce noticed it as well. He did not like it. Confidence had always been the foundation of his authority on the range. Every time Walter quietly identified another problem, that foundation seemed to weaken a little more. A vibration buzzed inside Ethan's pocket. He pulled out his phone and looked at the screen. The response had arrived. His eyes narrowed as he read it. Then he read it again. The senior chief's message contained only 7 words. Where did you find that patch? Ethan felt a chill despite the warm air. He quickly typed back, visitor at the range. Why? The response came almost immediately. Call me now. Ethan stared at the screen. The urgency was impossible to miss. He stepped farther away from the group and placed the call. The chief answered before the first ring finished. Tell me exactly where that man is. Ethan glanced toward Walter. The old veteran stood quietly beneath the fading sunlight, hands folded behind his back, watching the distant hills. Range 12, Ethan said. Silence followed. Not confusion, not uncertainty, recognition. Then the chief spoke again, his voice lower than before. Do not let him leave. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Who is he? Another pause. Longer this time. When the answer finally came, it sounded less like information and more like disbelief. Son, if that patch is real, there are generals on this base who are going to want to know he is standing out there. The phone call ended, but Ethan Brooks remained frozen for several seconds. Around him, the range continued exactly as before. The wind moved through the flags. Spotters watched through optics. Marines adjusted equipment and checked data. Yet somehow everything felt different now. He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked toward Walter Hayes. The old veteran stood near the edge of the firing line, his attention fixed on the distant terrain. He appeared completely unaware that a chain reaction had just begun somewhere far above the level of a training range. Ethan returned to the group. Sergeant Logan Pierce was still trying to salvage the afternoon. Another shooter had missed. Another set of corrections followed. Frustration was spreading through the unit like heat across asphalt. Walter quietly watched the process unfold. Then he pointed toward a distant ridgeline. The air is rolling off that slope now. Nobody responded immediately. A few hours earlier the comment would have triggered laughter. Now it triggered silence. Pierce noticed the change. He noticed Marines listening to the old man. He noticed eyes turning toward Walter whenever a shot missed. The realization irritated him more than he wanted to admit. You seem to have an opinion about everything, Pierce said. Walter nodded slightly. Only the things I can see. The answer drew no laughter. Ethan watched Pierce struggle to respond. Before he could, another vehicle appeared at the far end of the range road. A dark government SUV moved across the gravel, raising a trail of dust behind it. Nobody paid much attention at first. Senior personnel visited ranges all the time. The vehicle stopped near the administration building. A colonel stepped out. Ethan recognized him immediately. Colonel James Mercer. The officer moved with unusual urgency. He did not head toward the command office. He came directly toward the firing line. Several Marines straightened instinctively. Pierce looked confused. A colonel appearing unexpectedly was unusual enough. The expression on Mercer's face made it even stranger. The man looked concerned, almost anxious. His eyes scanned the range until they landed on Walter Hayes. Then he stopped walking. For a brief moment, he simply stared. Ethan saw the reaction clearly. Recognition. Not certainty. Not confusion. Recognition. Mercer approached slowly. The conversation across the range began to fade as Marines noticed his focus. Walter turned toward the approaching officer. The old man remained completely calm. Mercer glanced once toward the faded patch on Walter's shoulder. His face changed immediately. The color seemed to drain from it. Sir, the colonel said quietly. The single word carried more respect than anyone had heard all afternoon. Pierce blinked in surprise. Several Marines exchanged puzzled looks. Walter studied the colonel for a moment. Then he offered a small nod. Good afternoon. Mercer looked at the patch again. His eyes widened slightly. Whatever he had expected to find on range 12, it clearly was not this. He reached for his phone without taking his eyes off Walter. Ethan watched the movement carefully. The colonel stepped away and placed a call. His voice remained low, but one sentence drifted across the wind clearly enough for Ethan to hear. Sir, he is here. A long pause followed. Mercer listened. Then he stood straighter. Much straighter. Yes, General, he said. The words seemed to stop the air itself. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Somewhere beyond the range, a general had just received unexpected news. And judging by the colonel's expression, that news was moving far faster than anyone standing on the firing line yet understood. The mood on range 12 had changed completely. Nobody was laughing anymore. Conversations had faded into scattered whispers. Even the constant frustration surrounding the missed shots seemed less important now. Every eye drifted back toward Walter Hayes. The old veteran stood exactly where he had been all afternoon, calm and unhurried beneath the fading sunlight. Colonel James Mercer ended his call and lowered the phone slowly. His expression carried the weight of someone who had just confirmed something he never expected to be true. Sergeant Logan Pierce stepped closer. "Sir, what is going on?" Mercer looked at him for a moment, but did not answer. His attention returned to Walter. The silence stretched. Then another vehicle appeared on the distant access road. Unlike the first, this one did not arrive alone. Two black SUVs moved across the gravel in a cloud of dust. The vehicles approached quickly. Every Marine on the range noticed. Training stopped. Spotters lowered their optics. Shooters stood up from the firing line. Ethan Brooks felt his pulse quicken. He had seen senior visitors arrive before. This felt different. The vehicles stopped near the range entrance. Doors opened immediately. Several staff officers stepped out first. Then a tall man in a service uniform emerged from the second vehicle. The reaction was instant. Marines straightened without being told. Conversations died completely. General Richard Kane had arrived. The four-star general did not waste time greeting anyone. He did not ask for a briefing. He did not look at the range facilities. The moment his boots touched the gravel, his eyes searched the crowd. Then they found Walter Hayes. The general stopped walking. For a brief second, he simply stared. Ethan saw the change happen from nearly 50 yards away. Surprise, recognition, disbelief. The expression passed across the general's face so quickly that most people missed it. Then General Kane began moving again. Fast, much faster than anyone expected. Colonel Mercer stepped aside immediately. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound came from the wind snapping the range flags overhead. Walter turned as the general approached. The old veteran looked neither nervous nor impressed. If anything, he seemed mildly curious. General Kane stopped a few feet away. His gaze dropped toward the faded patch on Walter's shoulder. The patch that most people had ignored all afternoon. The patch that had triggered phone calls, urgent messages, and an unexpected visit from the highest-ranking officer on the installation. The general stared at it for several seconds. Then he looked back into Walter's eyes. "I never thought I would see one again," he said quietly. No one on the range understood what he meant. Pierce certainly did not. Ethan barely breathed. Walter glanced down at the worn patch. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "There are not many left." The general nodded slowly. The answer seemed to confirm everything. Around them, dozens of Marines stood frozen in confusion. They had spent hours treating the old man like an amusing visitor. Yet now a four-star general was standing in front of him with unmistakable respect. General Kane looked toward the display case holding the old rifle, then back toward Walter. His expression softened. "Sir," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I believe that rifle has been waiting a very long time for its rightful owner to see it again." For several seconds, nobody moved. The entire range seemed suspended between confusion and disbelief. General Richard Kane stood beside Walter Hayes, his attention fixed not on the firing line, not on the officers surrounding him, but on the quiet old man who had spent the afternoon being underestimated. The wind moved through the valley below. Red range flags snapped overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a loose piece of metal rattled softly against a target stand. The sound seemed impossibly loud inside the silence. Sergeant Logan Pierce stared at the general. He had spent years around senior officers. He knew respect when he saw it. What stood before him now was something deeper. It was reverence. General Kane turned toward the display case. "Open it," he said. The order was immediate. Within moments, a range custodian arrived with a key. The lock clicked. The glass door swung open. Carefully, almost ceremonially, the old rifle was lifted from its place of honor. The walnut stock caught the fading sunlight. Decades seemed to disappear from Walter's eyes as he looked at it. His hand rested lightly against the worn wood. Not possessive, familiar, like greeting an old friend after a lifetime apart. The range remained silent. General Kane stepped back and nodded toward the firing line. "Would you do us the honor, sir?" Walter glanced toward the distant target. The same target that had frustrated everyone throughout the afternoon. Then he looked at the young Marines. Some appeared embarrassed. Some looked confused. Others simply looked curious. Walter smiled faintly. The wind is finally settling. A few Marines exchanged surprised glances. Even now, that was what mattered to him. Not the attention, not the general, the wind. Walter walked slowly to the firing position. He studied the valley one last time. His eyes moved across the ridgeline, the grass, the distant trees. Then he settled comfortably behind the rifle. The posture looked natural, effortless, like something remembered rather than performed. Nobody spoke. Nobody shifted. The entire range watched. A few moments later, a single shot echoed across the valley. Then silence returned. The spotter froze behind his optic. He checked again, then a third time. His voice finally emerged, barely above a whisper. Direct center. The words seemed to hang in the air. No cheering followed. No celebration. The result felt almost secondary now. What mattered was everything that had led to it. Walter stood and carefully returned the rifle. The sunlight was fading. Long shadows stretched across the range. General Kane stepped forward and raised his hand in salute. Every Marine present watched in stunned silence. Walter returned the salute with the same quiet dignity he had carried all afternoon. Around them, nobody laughed anymore. Nobody doubted anymore. The patch that had seemed insignificant. The old jacket. The calm observations. The patience. Suddenly, every piece fit together. Ethan Brooks looked toward the distant hills and finally understood something that no training manual could teach. Experience does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it stands unnoticed at the edge of a firing line. And sometimes the people who have the most to teach are the ones least interested in talking about themselves. As the evening sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Walter Hayes turned and began walking toward the parking lot. No speech. No recognition ceremony. No demand for attention. Just a quiet departure. Behind him, an entire range stood watching. And for a long moment after he was gone, nobody said a word.